She's unstable. She's mentally incompetent. She's a drifter with no husband, no real career, and she lives in a shoebox apartment. My father was shouting so loudly in that courtroom, the veins in his neck were standing out like cords. His face had turned a frightening shade of red, and his finger was pointed straight at me like he wanted the judge to believe volume was evidence. "Look at her, Your Honor," he barked. "She can't even speak. She needs a conservator before she burns through her trust fund on whatever unstable people waste money on." I said nothing. I sat with my hands folded neatly in my lap and checked the time on my watch. 10:02 a.m. Right on schedule. Judge Mercer looked at him over the rim of her glasses, expression flat and unreadable. Then she asked in the calmest voice in the room, "You really don't know who she is, do you?" At the table beside him, my father's attorney froze halfway through turning a page. A bailiff had just handed him a document, and whatever he read there drained the color from his face so fast it was almost dramatic. The silence in that walnut-paneled room was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, the kind of silence that builds right before something breaks. I didn't look at my father. I looked instead at the stripe of sunlight hitting the counsel table and let my mind drift back 4 months to Christmas Eve, to the moment I finally understood that humiliation only hurts until you have leverage. We were seated at my father's dining table, the long, polished one in the house I was quietly paying the mortgage on. When I handed him my new business card, he looked at it, laughed, and tossed it onto the tablecloth like it was trash. "A consultant?" he said, swirling his scotch. "Is that what we're calling unemployed now, Mara? Cute little hobby, very creative." Everyone at that table smiled into their plates. I remember the heat in my face, the sting of being the daughter he treated like a permanent disappointment. But sitting in that courtroom, the memory didn't hurt anymore. It felt useful. Because while he was mocking my cute little hobby over roast beef and imported whiskey, that hobby had just secured a $15 million federal contract auditing a corrupted pharmaceutical supply chain. He saw a drifter. I was the founder and CEO of Blackstone Forensics, a forensic accounting firm built to track money that powerful people thought they could hide. And at that moment, the money I had been tracking was his. "She's catatonic," my father snapped, jerking me back to the present. "Look at her. She hasn't said a word. She's obviously medicated or having some kind of episode. I'm asking for immediate conservatorship." I adjusted the cuff of my blazer and kept my face still. Let him talk. If I argued, I would become the emotional daughter resisting authority. But silence did something much more useful. Silence made him look unstable. Silence gave him room to dig. Then he moved on to my living situation. "She lives in some rundown rental downtown," he scoffed. "She won't let family visit because she's ashamed of how she lives. It's probably a dump." I almost smiled. He was talking about the halcyon. He was right about one thing. I never let him visit. He was wrong about the rest. I did not live in a rundown apartment. I lived in the penthouse, and I didn't rent there. I owned the building. More importantly, I also owned the office tower where he leased his firm. The man trying to prove I was incompetent had signed rent checks for 2 years to companies that belonged to me and never noticed. By then, his lawyer was sweating through his collar. He kept scrolling through the dossier the bailiff had handed him, eyes widening line by line. I knew exactly what he was reading. Not my grandmother's financial records. Mine. I wasn't in that courtroom because I needed inheritance money. I made more in 1 quarter than my father had made in his entire career. I was there because he had tried to have me legally erased. And now he was about to discover that the lonely, unstable daughter he had spent 29 years belittling was the same woman financing the illusion of his success. Judge Mercer turned a page. The paper made a crisp, rhythmic sound in the quiet. 2 years earlier, my father's law practice had been dying. I found out the way I find out most things, by following the money. His password, by the way, had been Richard 1. That was my father in a nutshell, arrogant enough to think no one would ever need to look behind the curtain. He was months behind on payroll, buried in high-interest debt, floating his lifestyle on bad credit and worse judgment. A decent man would have cut expenses. A humble man would have asked for help. My father tried to have me committed. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. 2 officers showed up at my door with paperwork for an involuntary psychiatric hold. He had obtained it using a forged statement from a doctor friend from his golf club, claiming I was delusional, self-destructive, and burning through family assets on imaginary business ventures. His plan was simple: lock me away for 72 hours, file an emergency motion, gain control of my trust, and liquidate it before I could stop him. The officers stayed less than 5 minutes. My apartment was immaculate. I was calm, and the conference call playing through my speaker involved 2 federal investigators and a procurement officer. The hold fell apart immediately. I could have pressed charges then. I didn't. That would have been fast. And mercy, in my father's case, had never taught him anything. So the next morning, I formed Blackstone Capital, a holding company with a forgettable name and a Delaware registration. Through that company, I approached his bank and bought every distressed piece of debt tied to his practice. The loans, the credit line, the equipment lien, all of it. Then, I extended him $650,000 in new capital under the guise of a private investor. He never asked who was behind it. He never did due diligence. He saw money and assumed the world had finally recognized his brilliance. And what did he do with the lifeline I handed him? He bought a vintage Porsche. I remember him pulling into Thanksgiving dinner in that car, smug as a king, revving the engine in the driveway. At the table, carving turkey, he looked straight at me and said, "Maybe if you ever applied yourself, Mara, you wouldn't be such a burden on this family." I smiled and passed the potatoes. He was driving a car I had effectively paid for. He thought he owned the castle. He had never bothered to check who held the deed. "Your Honor," he said now, trying to recover his confidence, "we are wasting time. My daughter has no assets, no income, and no grasp on reality. She's terrified because she knows she is nothing without my support." That was when his attorney leaned in and whispered something urgent into his ear. My father brushed him off. "Not now," he muttered. Judge Mercer looked almost bored. "You may want to listen to counsel, Mr. Caldwell." Then she lifted a single page. "Because according to this filing, the petitioner isn't just your daughter. She is also the principal of the entity that currently holds your firm's senior debt." For one absurd second, my father laughed. A wet, ugly laugh. He actually looked relieved. "Exactly," he said. "This is what I mean. Delusions of grandeur. My daughter doesn't run a company. She can barely operate a toaster." His lawyer made a strangled sound and grabbed his sleeve. "Richard," he whispered, audibly shaking, "stop talking." My father tore his arm away and pointed at me again. "Look at her. Cheap suit, scuffed shoes, dent in her car. Successful people don't live like that." I glanced down at my shoes. They were scuffed. I had climbed through a warehouse window the previous week verifying inventory for a client. I never replaced them because I do not need my wealth to introduce itself before I do. Then he made the mistake that ended him. "She lives in the Halcyon," he sneered. "That crumbling brick building downtown. She probably rents some tiny unit with rats in the walls." Judge Mercer slid another document across the bench. "The Halcyon," she said evenly. Interesting choice of example, because according to county records, Miss Caldwell owns the building entirely, including the commercial suites currently occupied by your firm. My father stared at the page, then at me, then back at the judge. "That's impossible," he said. "My landlord is a corporate entity. I pay Vanguard Real Estate." "Yes," the judge said. "And Vanguard Real Estate appears to be one of several companies tied to the same controlling owner." She opened a thick binder. "Vanguard Real Estate, Vanguard Capital, Vanguard Holdings, all controlled by Miss Mara Caldwell." The room changed. Not loudly, just all at once. It felt as though every person there inhaled and forgot how to exhale. My father looked like a man trying to read a language his pride had prevented him from learning. "No," he said softly. Then louder, "No, this is fraud." He turned to his lawyer, desperate now. Tell her this is illegal. She can't own a law firm." That finally made me rise. For the first time that morning, I spoke. "You're right," I said. My voice was calm enough to cut. "I can't own your firm." I stepped around the table and walked toward him, my heels clicking against the floor in a slow, measured rhythm. His lawyer shrank back. My father stood his ground, because men like him mistake volume for power until the final second. "I know the rules, Richard," I said. "I studied them before I ever drew up the contracts you signed." I placed the loan file in front of him with a heavy, deliberate thud. "I didn't buy equity in your firm. I bought your debt." His eyes moved down to the page. I watched understanding begin to form, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. 2 years ago, I said, you were insolvent. 3 lenders rejected you. You were behind on payroll. You were using client funds to cover personal expenses. Vanguard acquired your loans, your credit line, and the lien on your equipment, then issued a $650,000 secured extension. I tapped the clause with one finger. "I am not your partner. I am your senior secured creditor." His lawyer closed his eyes. He knew. I kept going. "That means I do not own your practice. I own the right to seize your collateral the moment you default." My father looked up at me, pale now. "What default?" I checked my watch again. Paragraph 12, Section B, default by conduct. Publicly defaming or disparaging the guarantor in a recorded proceeding triggers immediate acceleration. I held his gaze. "You spent the last 20 minutes calling me incompetent, unstable, fraudulent, and incapable, on the record." I gave him the smallest, coldest smile of my life. "The loan is due now." His mouth actually fell open. "I don't have that kind of money," he said. "I know." I turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I am calling the note and requesting immediate enforcement." His attorney stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. "If enforcement is granted, the firm collapses." I looked at him without emotion. "Then I accept your client's collapse." That was when my father lunged for his phone. "I planned for this," he snapped, fingers flying over the screen. "I'm filing Chapter 7 right now. Automatic stay, you get nothing." He looked at me like he'd found his miracle. He hadn't. I reached into my folder and set down one last page. "Bankruptcy protects companies," I said softly, "not guarantors." He blinked. "You signed a personal guarantee, cross-collateralized. If the business fails, liability transfers to your personal estate." He stared at me. At the paper, at his own signature. And then, finally, I watched it happen. The arrogance left his face. Not all at once. Piece by piece, like a building giving way from the inside. "You didn't bankrupt the firm," I said. "You bankrupted yourself." Judge Mercer struck the bench with her gavel. Petition dismissed with prejudice. Enforcement granted. Commercial seizure effective immediately. Residential enforcement within 24 hours. My father didn't shout that time. He just sat there, small, stunned, looking at the wreckage of a life he had mistaken for power. His attorney began packing in silence. No speech, no defense, no dignity left to arrange. I gathered my files, turned, and walked out without looking back. That night, I stood in the corridor outside his office while the locksmith drilled out the lock. The brass nameplate with Caldwell and Pierce came off the frosted glass and dropped into a cardboard box with a flat little clatter. The liquidation team took inventory, computers, furniture, archived files, decorative nonsense bought on borrowed money. I watched for a minute, then left them to it. I never wanted his firm. I never wanted his house. I never wanted the Porsche, the memberships, the polished image, or the brittle little kingdom he built out of ego and debt. That $650,000 was never an investment. It was the price of my freedom. When I got home, I stood in the penthouse window overlooking the city he thought I was too fragile to survive. Then I took out my phone and deleted his number. Not blocked. Deleted. No ceremony. No final message. Just gone. And for the first time in my life, silence did not feel like suppression. It felt like peace. Sometimes people think revenge is fire. Loud, chaotic, destructive. Mine wasn't. Mine was paper. Signatures. Close. Dates. Wire transfers. A court record. And a man who spent 29 years calling me weak, only to discover, in public, that the woman he tried to erase had owned the ground beneath his feet the entire time.